The frontal recess dissection is found by locating the top of the unsnip process and fracturing it forward. This forms the anterior face of the Agonasi cell and is a useful, consistent landmark in sinus surgery. Once it has been fractured outwards, a kerrison can be used to remove the front face of the Agonasi cell. By taking this up as high as you can create direct access to the frontal sinus and allow visualization with a 0-degree scope for much longer. Here we are using an angled shaver burr, a RAD 60, to remove the mucosa and the bone that has been dissected away. We now have full exposure of the Agonasi cell using a 0-degree endoscope. Here we can see the posterior Agonasi, and we can also see a supra-Agonasi cell located laterally. Medially, we follow the drainage pathway, fracturing the posterior wall of the Agonasi laterally. It is always better to fracture laterally to avoid injury to the skull base. What we can visualize here is that this patient also has an intersinus septal cell. Once the Agonasi posterior wall has been fractured, it can be removed with a giraffe forceps to allow better visualization of this region and instrumentation of the frontal sinus ostium. Here we can see that this is the intersinus septal cell. You will note that it is a blind-ending sac and there are no septations running within it, which distinguishes it from a frontal sinus proper. We can see that the drainage pathway has been displaced medially to sit between the supraagocele and the intersinus septal cell. The drainage pathway can then be gradually opened up with removal of the bone and preservation of as much mucosa as possible. Typically, the steps are to fracture the bone and then to remove the mucosa using a microdebrider. Here we can see the beginning of the frontal sinus. We will need to change to a 30-degree scope to visualize the actual frontal sinus itself. And here we can see the roof of the frontal sinus and septations running within it. Once we are happy that we have obtained the frontal sinus ostia, we can then proceed to enlarge the ostia laterally out towards the orbit and medially fracturing the intersinus septal cell. This is important to maximize the diameter of the frontal sinus. Again, caution needs to be exerted to prevent mucosal stripping, which will ultimately affect the ultimate size and healing of the frontal sinus. Using the microdebrider or a curette, we now fracture the medial wall of that intersinus septal cell, loosening this medial barrier, and this will allow further enlargement of the frontal sinus ostium. Using a giraffe forceps, we can then remove this partition and the small fragments of cells behind it. Once this partition has been removed, we can use an angled kerrison, also known as a cobra, to remove the remaining lateral portion of the intersinus septal cell. And here we can start to appreciate the frontal sinus proper. Ideally, I like to perform this dissection with scans to predict the anatomy, but where you don't have scans easily visible or you are concerned, staggered dissection is an alternative technique.